we're now recording. And also just want to do a couple of quick reminders before we get started. If you have not been on Zoom before, it could be one of your first times, I want to let you know how to interact with us here. If you look at the icons at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box. If you have questions throughout the presentation and throughout the whole evening, you can throw your questions in the chat box. When you click on it, you'll see a section pop up on the right-hand side of your screen and just list whatever you can there, and I will monitor those and get to them at some point during the evening. Also, you can click on the participant icon at the bottom of your screen, and if you do that, you'll see the list of everybody who is on this call show up in the right-hand side, and if you hover over your name, you can raise your hand. And so when we get to questions later, that is one way you can ask a question. And just know that that is there. And again, if you're just joining us, if you hover over your picture in Zoom, there are 3 dots in the top right corner. If you click on that, you'll see the ability to rename yourself. You can have your name and then put your school's name next to it, so all of us know who's represented here in the meeting. And if that doesn't work for you, that is okay, but that is one way we can get to know each other a little bit better and connect during these crazy times. Let's see, I'm going to keep all of you on mute for now, just to keep the noise down. And when I'll go over again how to ask questions once our legislators have finished giving sort of their opening remarks. So that is it for the logistics. Again, my name is Michelle Parker. I am the Vice President of Legislation for the District PTA. We have many of our board members here on the call with us tonight, and they can designate themselves a 2nd District PTA next to their names also, so you know who they are and you can start to put names with faces. This is the 4th in our series of these 411 meetings, providing information to you and connecting you with other PTA leaders all across the city. We've been really happy to have such a diverse representation participating in these. We are going to be having a few more all the way through the end of school. Just a quick note, and I'll announce it again at the end. But next week, we're going to have the superintendent, Dr. Matthews, join us from SFUSD, and he's going to be talking to us about what to expect next year, start to give us an idea of what next year could look like. And then the following week is going to be a very advocacy-oriented week. We're going to have half of the meeting be with the campaign director for the Schools and Communities First Ballot Measure, and then the second half of the meeting will be with the school board president, Mark Sanchez, and the budget chair, Jenny Lamb, who are both going to talk to us about ways we can all work together to advocate for more funding for our schools. So that is what's coming up. So I'll go ahead and get us started and introduce you to our special guests. I'm going to start with Senator Scott Wiener. Senator Weiner represents San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. Elected in 2016, Senator Weiner focuses extensively on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. He chairs the Senate Housing Committee and also chairs the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus. Before being elected to the Senate, Senator Weiner served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing the district previously represented by Harvey Milk, and chaired the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Before being elected to office, Senator Weiner practiced law for 15 years, including nearly a decade as a deputy city attorney in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. He also served in a number of community leadership roles, including co-chair of the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Senator Weiner has lived in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 1997. He received degrees from Duke University and Harvard Law School and spent a year in Chile on a Fulbright scholarship. Welcome, Senator, and I will go ahead and introduce our other two, and then I will turn the time to Senator Weiner first. Our next guest is Assemblymember Ting. Assemblymember Ting was elected to the State Assembly in 2012, representing the 19th Assembly District, which spans the west side of San Francisco, as well as the communities of Broadmoor, Colma, Daly City, and South San Francisco. As California navigates new challenges from the federal government, Ting is focused on protecting our values and persisting onward with progressive policies that expand opportunity for all, ensure equal rights, and protect our environment. Informed by past roles in the financial sector and as San Francisco's assessor recorder, Ting has been a leading voice on California's finances. He now serves as chair of the Assembly Budget Committee and previously served as chair of the Assembly Revenue and Taxation Committee and chair of the Assembly Democratic Caucus. And then our final guest is Assemblymember Chiu. As a member of the California State Legislature, David Chiu represents the 17th Assembly District, which encompasses eastern San Francisco. He was first elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2016 and 2018. During David's first year, he served as Assistant Speaker pro tempore. Since 2016, he has served as chair of the Assembly Housing and Community Development Committee. He also sits on the following legislative committees: Budget, Business and Professions, Judiciary, Arts, Entertainment, Sports, Tourism, and Internet Media. He also serves as chair of the California Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus. During his first 4 years in the Assembly, David has authored 48 bills that were signed into law by the governor. Among other efforts, the bills addressed the state's housing crisis, protected tenants, assisted LGBT families, upheld a women's right to choose, promoted sustainable transportation options, and facilitated voting by young people. Before he was on the State Assembly, he served as president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors for 6 years. And with a reputation as a consensus maker, Chiu was the first board president in San Francisco history elected by fellow supervisors to 3 consecutive terms, and the first Asian American to hold the post. We are so glad to have all of you here tonight. And so just a quick overview, they're going to spend a few minutes each just talking about some of their own priorities and work that they are doing at the state level. Many of you pre-submitted questions to us, which I shared with them before tonight. And so we'll be going through some of those. As questions come up for you, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And I'll go over again how these questions will work after all 3 of them have gone. So why don't we go ahead and start with Senator Weiner.
Great, am I unmuted? Okay. So thank you, Michelle, for organizing this and for having us. And thank you all for taking some time tonight during this very unique moment in, I think, all of our lives. You know, I just first want to say how proud I am. I'm always proud to be a San Franciscan, but I'm particularly proud now that this city has really pulled together in a huge way to address this pandemic and to flatten the curve and to really ensure that our hospitals don't get overwhelmed. And I want to compliment the mayor and our director of public health, Grant Colfax, who just really stepped up. And so it just makes me really proud that we live in a city that deeply understands public health. We went through the worst of the HIV/AIDS pandemic here in San Francisco. We get it, and we have great people leading us, so thank you. So we just returned to Sacramento. The Assembly went into session last week, and the Senate started on Monday after we had a couple months of emergency recess due to the pandemic. Before we went on recess in March, we appropriated $1.1 billion in emergency appropriations for fighting the pandemic that the governor has been deploying to help local governments, to around homelessness, around PPE, around support for our hospitals, and so on and so forth. 100 million of that was for schools, and particularly for cleaning schools. Now that we are back, we're in a condensed legislative session, and we are really focusing, obviously, on what we need to do to fight this pandemic. And I'm focused on data collection, particularly in the LGBTQ community, because we're not really collecting that data on our community, and we know that LGBTQ people have heightened risk factors for COVID, but also on protecting our small businesses who are at severe risk, particularly restaurants, cafes, bars, which are so important for our neighborhoods and for our economy. And we're working on legislation to make sure that they actually have a fighting chance to stay in business and to keep their space and be able to pay their rent. Working with Phil, and I'm sure he'll talk about it, on legislation to protect renters. We are very, very focused on housing stability right now. It's going to be very hard to get our economy up and running, to get our schools up and running, to start moving back towards normal if people are concerned about the stability of their housing, if they are way behind on their rent or on their mortgage. And so we're all very focused on making sure that people can remain housed and that we try to improve the health of our housing situation. And so we're going to be continuing this year, and it's a group effort to work on increasing housing production in California. Even though we are very focused on COVID, we have pre-existing problems that are still with us, and then in some ways have been made worse by the pandemic. Housing is one of them. And we need to make sure that as we come out of this, we come out in a stronger way around housing, because we were very weak going in due to decades of bad housing policy. A big focus for me this year, always a focus, but especially this year, is addressing the epidemics of mental health problems and addiction. We have huge challenges in California and in San Francisco with lack of access to treatment for people who are experiencing mental health and addiction problems. And we see it particularly with our young people, because we know that 1/2 of mental health issues arise by the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24. And so I've done work over the years to try to get more resources focused on the mental health needs of kids who are in middle school, high school, and college age. And this year we have a very aggressive bill to require insurance companies to cover all medically necessary mental health and addiction care. Right now, if you have private insurance, there's a good chance that your insurance company will only cover crisis care for mental health and addiction, like you're already unraveling, already going to the psych ER, already in deep trouble, as opposed to care when you're just starting to experience issues, to try to prevent it from becoming a crisis. And we see this with our kids, we see this with people of all age groups. And so we want to require the insurance companies to cover all care that a physician thinks is medically necessary. We are also very focused this year, every year it's a focus for me, in expanding access to CalFresh. We have a huge food insecurity problem in San Francisco and throughout the state, which is it's maddening to me and to a lot of people. Housing is really hard. Fixing a housing problem where you're short millions of homes, you need huge investment in affordable housing, it's hard. Fixing food insecurity is not hard. It is not rocket science. It just takes the commitment to provide the resources so people have food. It's not expensive like housing is. And yet we make it very hard in California for people to even sign up for CalFresh. And so we're doing legislation this year to try to streamline and make it much easier. We have a very low rate of people who are eligible for CalFresh actually receiving it. And this is federal money we're leaving on the table. Food insecurity is so much worse now because of COVID-19. And so for me, it's making it easier to get CalFresh, getting more resources into our food banks. These have to be high priorities this year. I know that Assemblymember Ting, the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, will talk in more detail about the budget. It is not pretty. It's going to be a huge deficit, and we're going to have to make some very painful choices. I think it is so important that we defend funding for our public schools. We have made at least some progress over the past decade in getting better per pupil spending and moving California out of the basement into the whatever is just above the basement. We have more work to do, and we need to not backslide. Our Senate leadership has put out some ideas that were announced yesterday about ways that we can soften the budget blow on some of these critical services by essentially allowing people to prepay their taxes over a period of time, which will be a budget hit in the future, but it would be spread out over a decade, and we could advance some of that money and save critical services now. So this will be a big topic of conversation in terms of how we navigate the budget process. But with all that said, again, thank you. And I know we are going to continue to be effective in fighting this pandemic. And as we do so, we need to address some of the huge problems that COVID-19 has cast a major spotlight on. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. And just really quickly before we move on to Assemblymember Ting, the mental health bill that you were just talking about, that's SB 855, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe the California State PTA endorsed that bill.
Yes, absolutely. There's a huge coalition behind it. It's basically the whole world against the insurance companies and the California Chamber of Commerce at this point. And it's really been amazing to me how many groups that I never really thought were focused on mental health and addiction have come out of the woodworks to support the bill. You know, and we're seeing with COVID, there was a study that came out the other day. There's something called, I think it's death by despair. People who, whether it's suicide, drug overdose, alcohol-related deaths, people who are they're in despair because of their situation in life, and they end up effectively either intentionally or unintentionally killing themselves. There's about 180,000 of these deaths by despair every year in the US. A new study came out saying that coronavirus, this pandemic, could lead to an additional up to 154,000 deaths by despair. People are isolated, it's traumatic, people are alone, they're depressed, they have anxiety, they have, you know, we know I've been monitoring in my own neighborhood, the Castro, about people who are in recovery, and we're starting to see people who are in recovery from meth relapsing. And so it is a very, it was already an acute situation. It is now even more acute, and it is outrageous that in California, we don't require insurance companies to cover all medically necessary care for mental health unless you're in crisis. So it's sort of like saying, well, we know you just got diagnosed with stage 1 cancer. We'll give you coverage when you're at stage 4. We would laugh them out of the room if they said that, and yet we tolerated that for the health of our brain, and that shouldn't be.
Absolutely. Thank you for championing that. And that's something we also know and are talking a lot about in our schools as a need that we have, is to increase the number of services. We're going to need more, not less, even though we're looking at massive budget shortfalls.
We need to bring back the nurses and the guidance counselors. I sound like I'm dating myself. I remember when I was a kid, at every school we had a full-time guidance counselor, a full-time nurse who was there all day. And when I, you know, now the fact that they rotate around numerous schools, it's like you're putting everything on the teachers without having that professional support for these kids' physical and mental health and just everything. It's just tragic.
It absolutely is. Thank you. The last thing I wanted to just ask you if you could quickly do for us before I move on is, we're going to have, you saw a lot of the pre-submitted questions that we had, and I'm sure that some that will come up. Would you mind just telling everybody here quickly about the role of the state versus the school district in decision making, like when school starts or when it's approved? You know, just the school districts are trying to decide which day they'll start in the fall, and budgetary decisions. Could you give us a really brief kind of framework on whose role is what? In terms of COVID in particular. For COVID and just generally, you know, who makes decisions about school calendars and
I mean, it's, you know, obviously the state sets many of the basic rules, like when we set the school start time at 8:30 a.m. last year, and I know a lot of times it's very controversial, but we do set those rules. In terms of the calendar year, the state is going to have to play a role in terms of, as the calendar gets shuffled around, and in terms of the number of days or hours of education time, there's going to have to be flexibility provided by the state. Some of that can be done legislatively to give dispensation or additional flexibility. A lot of it can be done by executive order from the governor. The governor has very broad authority to issue executive orders in an emergency situation. And it's faster because even, you know, we've been having this whole kerfuffle about not collecting any data about the impacts of the pandemic on the LGBTQ community. So we're doing legislation. We would love the governor just to issue an executive order. He can get it done right away. So that in a lot of areas, the governor can do that, and it's faster and more efficient for him to do it. Less community feedback in terms of hearings, but he can do it. In addition, this superintendent of public instruction, Tony Thurman, who's been doing a fantastic job throughout, and has a number of stakeholder groups active right now to try to create guidance for how schools should be open. What are protocols around social distancing when you have young kids who are not really that good or programmed and wired to do the opposite of social distancing? How do you deal with cleaning? How do you deal with food service? All of these remote learning. So that work is ongoing. I know the governor made a comment a few weeks ago at one of his noon briefings about, well, maybe we'll open over the summer, allow the schools to open earlier. And I think he was doing that. And of course, we would all, I think a lot of us would love that. And I think a lot of parents would probably be really appreciative of, maybe not all, but I think, you know, a lot of quality time with the kids these days. So some might appreciate an early school year. But I know there were a lot of school districts who were like, wait, I don't know that we're going to be ready to do that. We don't know if we'll be ready health-wise or protocol-wise or resource-wise. So I think that's a work in progress. And I think in the end, school districts are probably going to make a lot of their own decisions about when exactly they start. And I suspect that the state will provide a fair amount of flexibility. And different communities, right, you're going to have, so some of these counties that have very, very few infections that the state is authorizing to, you know, open up their economy earlier, they're probably going to be ready to go back to school before a place like Los Angeles is. Los Angeles still has, you know, more significant COVID problems than the Bay Area does. So I suspect there'll be a lot of local flexibility. There'll be a lot of interactions between school districts and their county health departments. And I think that what the governor and legislature will do is try to provide flexibility, guidance, hopefully resources, and a path so that schools feel comfortable that if we do the following things, and if our infection rates are in a certain place, we're okay to reopen.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that context for the audience who may not know how some of that works. Okay, I'm going to move us over to Assemblymember Ting. Let's see him. I know he must be ready here. So Assemblymember Ting, if you want to take a few minutes and talk about some of your focus areas, and of course, remember that that Member Ting is also the chair of the Budget Committee, Assembly Budget Committee. So hopefully he'll have some things to tell us about that.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for all the parents in the audience. I have a 7th grader and a 4th grader at San Francisco Unified. So like so many parents over the last few weeks, been struggling with Zoom classes, new schedules, trying to figure out what homeworkers do, what's not, what's optional. So I know it's been a completely new world for all of us. Let me talk a little bit about just the budget first, and I can go to some of my legislative priorities. For the budget, as you've all been reading, we have a very challenging budget situation. When we were talking in January, we thought we had a surplus. Even when we went into recess in March, it seemed like we were still in pretty good fiscal health. By shutting down our economy, asking people to stay home, stay safe, we've taken a huge hit to not only this year's budget, but next year's budget. And the biggest and most challenging budget will probably be the fiscal year 21-22 budget. You've all heard of the governor's $54 billion shortfall between this year and next year. The legislative analysts came out with a slightly different interpretation, really looking at about a $45 billion shortfall. And again, so much of the information we just don't know. And so much of this depends on if we can get a vaccine, when people can go out. Once people do go out before we have a vaccine, if we ever have a vaccine, are we going to ask people to go back and stay at home? So there is so much uncertainty, and we're trying our best to predict what the future really holds. The main difference between, I would say, the governor and the legislative analysts is the governor really is looking at the worst case, most pessimistic scenario, and also doesn't include all the money we are getting back from the federal government. So we got money from the CARES Act. We are getting reimbursed from FEMA for much of our COVID expenses. And so that $54 billion really goes down quickly, but it really is somewhere between $18 to $30 billion problem, which again is very large. I know that for all the, not just San Francisco Unified, but all the districts, they keep talking to our committee about the COLAs and trying to get more funding for next year. I think it would be a major feat if we could just hold people harmless, hold districts harmless. We held districts harmless starting from when COVID hit and we asked everybody to shut down till now. We don't know what's going to happen regarding this summer or earlier start times. I'm glad to hear that Dr. Matthews will be with you next week. I may want to listen in just as a parent to kind of get a better sense of what school might look like in the fall and when it might start. And are we going to be staggering kids, or are we going to be doing virtual every other day, or how's it really going to work? So in terms of the budget process, just to give all of you a sense of what's going to be happening, tomorrow the governor will put out his May revise. By the end of the month, the Assembly and the Senate will put forward their versions of the budget or their thoughts on the budget. And then we spend the first week of June figuring out where we all agree and coming up with one budget which gets passed by June 15th. What we need to really take into account this year isn't just the potential shortfall for this year and next year, but really the potentially large shortfall in 2 years. So obviously you all know education is a huge part of the state budget. Between early education to higher education, it's about half the general fund. It's a huge proportion of the funding. So the challenge is when you have such a big portion of your money going to education, it's your number one priority. But anytime you have a shortfall, it's very difficult to not do something around education. Now, what we could do to not do any budget cuts is either to raise revenue or borrow money. And so I assume that you're going to see some semblance of borrowing, and you'll probably see potential revenue proposals, like there was a vaping tax that the governor talked about in January. I expect that we're going to see that again. It doesn't bring in a ton of money, but it'll help. So we're going to be spending the next few weeks really focused on education. This is something that's one of my major priorities and been working on constantly. In fact, this year I was hoping that we could figure out how to have either a universal TK or a universal pre-K. And unfortunately, before COVID, that was one of my major priorities. And after COVID, doesn't look like we'll be able to look at that bill again. So just some of the legislative priorities that I'm working on as well. Like Scott and like David, we've all been focusing on different housing proposals. Last year, I was fortunate enough to pass a proposal to streamline the construction of ADUs all around the state. This year, I have a housing bill that's stopping HOAs from banning the rental of their property. We do have some homeowners associations which ban the rental of units in their association. That's something I'm continuing to work on. I'm working along with Senator Wiener on a bill that's a foreclosure and eviction moratorium for residential property. He has a bill that's working on commercial property. We want to make sure that we don't have mass evictions. The last thing we want to do is with already 150,000 homeless people on our streets is to exacerbate that problem by having mass evictions. So what we want is an eviction foreclosure moratorium during the period of COVID and during the time we have a state of emergency, to make sure when we're telling people to stay at home, that they have a home to stay in. And then just lastly, one of the bills I hope to complete is we had a minimum recycled content beverage bill, which is all those plastic bottles. The only thing in the environment that's really gotten worse is we've seen much more plastics consumption, because now we can't reuse our bags. You see many disposable plastic products, whether you're doing takeout, whether you're going to the grocery store. So mine is to do with the beverage bottles, and to create more recycled content in beverage bottles for soda or bottled water. We got a bill to the governor. Unfortunately, he vetoed it last year, so we're going to be taking some amendments and having that bill go back to him so that we could actually create a true California minimum recycled plastics market. So again, really, really thank you so much for being here tonight. I know it's a tough time right now. I know everybody is just struggling. The teachers are struggling. The districts are struggling. The parents are struggling. This is not an ideal situation for any of us, but this is what we need to do to make sure we're keeping people safe, keeping people healthy. So really appreciate everyone's patience during this very tough time.
Thank you so much. Okay, we'll move on to Assemblymember Chiu to give a few thoughts about what he's been working on, and then we'll go to questions to all of you.
Right on. Thanks, Michelle. Good evening, everyone. Appreciate you all jumping on this call. And let me also add my thanks to your ongoing leadership. 25 years ago, when I was in graduate school, I studied sort of institutions that stabilize and strengthen our communities. And the PTA in every community across the country was always near or at the very top of the list. So just appreciate all of your volunteer hours and everything you're doing. Also just want to commiserate with all of you, all of us who are parents. My son had insisted he wants to jump on this town hall. He's 4. I'm trying to keep him out of the room, but I don't lock it, because if I lock the door, as you know, he just starts banging on it. See him shortly. But definitely feel everyone's pain. Usually when I come home at night after a long day in Sacramento, I always relieve my wife. And so I'm supposed to be having primary duty, but Michelle had promised me that this is a crowd that might not mind if a little kid pops his face up in a moment. So, Michelle had asked sort of what sort of things have we focused on in the area of student and education. And let me just start. I'll just tick through a few topics that I've been passionate about before coronavirus, and then chat a few moments about some of the things we're working on now during this pandemic. I am now in my 6th year in the legislature, and during the past half a decade have been working on things like trying to help educate STEM educators and really beef up that aspect of our teaching core. Have authored a major bill around student bullying. We have seen a dramatic increase, frankly, unfortunately, since Donald Trump was elected, of Muslim students being bullied, of Jewish students being bullied, of immigrant kids being bullied, of African-American kids being bullied. It's all ramped up, probably, unfortunately, modeling some very bad adult behavior. The last couple of years, I've also focused a lot on the plight of homeless youth. We have just an incredible number of kids who are sort of off the radar in school systems throughout the state, who literally don't have homes, or who are living tripled up in very small living quarters. This past year, I've had a bill to help ensure that transgender students have access to student records that reflect their identities. I have for the past 12 years, I was the original champion author, and then helped to bring about the new voting structure we have with our school board in San Francisco of allowing immigrant parents to vote in school board elections. So that's something I've been passionate about. And then as a former civil rights attorney, have been part of a number of us who've been pushing for extending healthcare to all, but particularly regardless of immigration status. So in the last couple of years, we've been able to get healthcare to all kids, including undocumented kids. So it's a cliche to say that the pandemic changed everything. Phil did a great job of sort of summarizing the budget picture. I'll just add to it that, with 4 million Californians who are unemployed, with a likely 25% drop in our revenues, what we're estimating is a 20% drop or more in our ability to fund our schools. It is worse than any of us can imagine. I think all of you saw the headlines locally in San Francisco. They're estimating an $82 million budget deficit this coming year, a $108 million budget deficit the year after, just in our school district alone. This is replicated throughout the state. Super glad to hear that you guys are going to be briefed in a few weeks by the Schools and Communities First initiative. That's something I believe has to get done. It would be catastrophic if it doesn't, but it's going to be incredibly difficult. Let me just touch on a few areas that I'm working on, and then a few things that we are thinking about as policymakers moving in the following months. So as a chair of the Housing Committee, I've spent an awful lot of time and had hoped that this was going to be the year we really tackled homelessness. And I have bills to establish for the first time in California a permanent source of funding for homelessness by reforming our tax policy around mortgage interest deductions, essentially tax breaks to individuals who are fortunate enough to own vacation homes. Also have a bill that would require every city and county in the state to really truly hold them accountable to spending money when they say they're going to spend it around homelessness, and actually citing facilities, navigation centers, shelters, permanent supportive housing for folks who are homeless. And then also I have a bill that's effectively an audit of all the things we're doing throughout the state when it comes to homelessness. Related to that, I think many of us have focused on the plight of folks who are really falling through our social safety net. I have a bill that would try to help stabilize our board and cares, which are facilities that would assist a lot of folks who have serious mental illnesses, who are oftentimes being kicked out on the streets because these smaller group settings are being shut down. Another bill that would streamline the process for folks to apply for a wide variety of social service programs. And then I'll just mention a topic that we're seeing a lot of. I mentioned student bullying before. As the chair of the API Legislative Caucus, we have seen a horrifying number of anti-Asian hate incidents. And we've heard a lot of incidents involving kids. And so spending a lot of time sort of thinking about what sorts of things we can do in that area. Let me just close by talking a little bit about kind of questions for our schools moving forward. As Scott alluded to, a lot of decisions, the actual decisions are made by local school districts. We set broad parameters. But for example, when the school district reopens, that is purely within the purview of our local school system. And you know, the enormous challenge right now is with the pandemic. There are all sorts of new things we're going to need to do. So for example, it's pretty likely that kids and teachers are going to have to wear masks in the classroom for potentially quite some time. We need to think about how to socially distance students and teachers, and what that would mean theoretically, ideally, is smaller class sizes, staggered schedules, really shift learning, which our superintendent is talking about, obviously disinfecting classrooms and facilities, etc. The challenge with all of these things is they require not less money, but more money. And so we're really, this is difficult. No bones about it. And, you know, I think one of the things that Scott and Phil and I are trying to do is to really set expectations about just how difficult this is going to be. But that being said, you know, we are a city and we are a state that has survived many catastrophes over the decades. I have full faith that that with the ingenuity of San Franciscans and Californians, we will figure this out. It's going to be difficult, but I know we're all committed to doing this together, and we will do this work together. So again, thank you for your engagement. And Michelle, turning back to you, looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Chiu, and to all three of you for sharing what you've been working on at the state level and getting us a little window into some of your priorities. We had some pre-submitted questions, which many of you touched on already, related to funding and how schools will open, how we will know when they can open, you know, what the state is doing related to that. And so there's a few other questions I wanted to bring up. You all were talking about funding. That's top of our mind, many of us, how we're going to pay for all these things. And so what I'm wondering is, how can we look at the immediate needs we're facing in the community in this crisis and in general, but also look towards long-term stability of education funding? So for instance, Southern California Assemblymember Marzouchi had proposed a bill that would increase education funding over a period of years to get us more in the top 10 in the country versus the bottom where we are. And so how are you all thinking about bills like that maybe I don't know if that one in particular is now off the table given the situation and the condensed session, but how can we address both? Look at the short-term needs, but also be thinking about long-term stability of our essential services in the state. Anybody can take it, whoever would like to. You have to unmute yourself. Sorry, you're all muted. You can unmute yourselves if you like.
Oops, sorry about that. I was just going to say, you know, Al's bill is great. It's very aspirational. The challenge is it needs money to fund it. And so David talked about Schools and Communities First, which is on the ballot this November. I know I was also working with some other colleagues to look at a backup plan if Schools and Communities First didn't pass, and that was looking at asking corporation or raising the corporate tax, because corporations got a huge tax break from President Trump. Could we take some of that money back, or ask for some of that money back through California taxes, and also potentially increase taxes for high income earners? The the major challenge is you really can't truly fund schools unless you decide to go raise revenue. And so I think, this PTA really understands that. This district really understands that, very supportive of all the different partial tax measures as well as the school bond measures. But so many other places, they don't see that direct connection, that when there are these revenue proposals on the ballot, that they don't see, oh, well, this will actually impact my schools. This will actually help my schools. And I think we need to do a better job to make sure really parents and voters see and really understand that connection. We're going to see it this November. There's going to be a lot of negative campaigning against schools and communities for us to really distort the information that we all know is true, which is these taxes will go directly to schools, have a huge impact on our schools, and much of our local public services are really going to be cut over the next few months. So it's absolutely critical to not just support that particular proposal, but also look at other long-term revenue proposals to really make sure that we get that funding. So Al's bill talks about how much more money we would need. I think it was like $40 billion. I think what we have to do is put our heads together to figure out, okay, well, how do we go raise $30 to $40 billion? It's just like all the folks who are PTA presidents. When you start off with your PTA budget and you go, it's we're going to go raise 200,000 or 400,000 or 100,000. You don't sit there and just go, okay, well, let's hope it just happens. There's a plan. There's a number of fundraisers. There's very direct appeals on how you're going to go raise that funding. So I would say the same thing. If we're all fans of Al's bill, we should get together and figure out how we're going to go raise that $35 billion.
I mean, I think that Phil is right. It's about how do we raise that money, and it is really hard. So schools and communities first. I'm a strong supporter of it as well. I think it's long overdue on a policy level, even apart from the money. On a policy level, the fact that big commercial corporate property gets the same or more Prop 13 protection than you do for your home, it's just fundamentally unfair. If we're able to get it passed, and it's not a gimme, the polling has always been not a landslide on that measure. And I don't think any of us knows what the mood is going to be in November. It could be that people really want to make public investments and want to raise money. It's all good, or it could be that people are very sensitive to anything that's a tax increase. So we don't know yet how Schools and Communities First is going to do. I pray that it wins. We need to work hard. But even if it wins, I think the estimates I've seen is it'll end up raising about $10, $11 billion a year. Figure about half of that, because the funding formulas go to K through 14, through K through 12 and community college under Prop 98. So let's call it $5 billion for K through 12. That's great. That's very significant. But it's not everywhere we need to go. Taxes are still very hard in California. I several times now, and I just hit a wall and get knocked back and have to close up shop every time. I've introduced an estate tax for California. We have not had an estate tax in almost 40 years. The federal estate tax has been demolished. It's one of the most progressive taxes. There's a massive exemption, $22 million for a couple. So I propose having an estate tax here, which would raise billions. It never gets the slightest bit of traction. Senator Nancy Skinner proposed putting a tax on corporations where the CEO makes more than a certain number of times what the average worker at the company makes. Try to recoup some of the Trump tax cut that they got, but also try to encourage more equitable salary structures. That bill didn't really get very far. So we have a lot of good progressive revenue ideas in the legislature that really, really, really struggle. And let's just hope that this constitutional amendment passes.
Thank you for that. So another issue that a lot of parents have been talking about recently is college in the fall. Our graduating seniors and colleges in the fall. CSU's just announced yesterday that they're moving towards more of an online structure. And so as we're looking at potential fall models, do you all have any other insight on how UCs will approach the situation, community colleges, and because they are so heavily funded also by the state, do you have any insight on how that will affect higher ed? our state schools?
I think the insight is it's going to be as challenged as every other part of the system. And I think it's fair to say that college experience, unfortunately for college freshmen, is probably going to be very different this fall than it was for freshmen this past fall. So CSU just announced that they're going to be going online. The UC campuses are essentially saying they're at least going to go hybrid. So they're going to be doing a lot of online and some limited in-person courses. What we're also, though, hearing is that UCs and CSUs may not be able to provide housing for the same number of students. So that's going to be an incredible challenge. And everyone's trying to figure out this whole social distancing piece. So, I hate to say, and I've been contacted by a lot of parents of seniors who are trying to figure out what the next steps are. And it will be different. I wish we could say something differently. I want to just echo at the end of what Scott and Phil were saying about revenues. I think this is a group that understands how important revenues are. And I think we're not going to be able to really change this unless PTAs across the state decide to make a difference. There's sort of a conventional wisdom in the legislature that every year there are only a handful of revenue measures that will even be considered. And in even years, election years, very few of them are allowed to be taken up for a vote by leadership because it puts, say, vulnerable Democrats in purple districts in a very potentially exposed place politically. So it's very challenging. Phil and Scott and I have the luxury of having constituents who understand, as I and others have proposed, that we should consider taxing the oil industry because we're the only major oil producing state in the country that doesn't tax oil. We should think about raising cigarette taxes and vaping taxes. I have been leading, Scott's been talking about the estate tax. I've been focused on the mortgage interest deduction, which on the surface sounds really great. It is the largest set of tax breaks in housing policy in our state. About $8 billion a year go to Californians, the vast majority of whom make over $100,000 a year. Your average homeowner gets 14 times as many tax breaks as a renter. And the policy shows that the mortgage interest deduction, from progressive to conservative economists, they all show it doesn't increase home prices. And yet we continue to spend money, and we're not spending money trying to figure out how to educate our kids. But to change this is remarkably difficult. It takes 2/3 votes in the legislature, and it's really, really hard. And this is going to be true for K through 12, but certainly also for higher ed. We've got to stabilize our revenues if we're going to give our kids the experiences that all of us were fortunate to get.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to another question, but I do want to note that there was a kind of a follow-up in the chat box about how average citizens can help fuel momentum around the kind of initiatives you all are talking about.
Yeah.
And I will just say quickly that in response to that, and if anybody wants to later mention this, talking about it with people in your community, raising awareness that there are opportunities like this, and especially talking to people in other parts of the state who have legislators who are not as big of a fan, because legislators generally need their constituents to back them up. And so if you have family in LA and you have family in a red county who tends to be pretty anti-tax, but you support these measures, convince your family members to support these measures and to call their own state representatives, because the more that legislators have their constituents backing them up, the more cover they have to take the votes that we need them to take. I wanted to move on to asking you all how we are supporting vulnerable communities right now, and especially youth who tend to be isolated and already at risk. We've talked a little bit about LGBT youth. We have foster youth, justice-involved youth, and others who are at much higher risk during this crisis than even they typically are.
Phil, sorry.
No. Well, I'm just going to say, I'll not just be brief. It's been very challenging. If you talk to teachers, we forget often that one of the major social safety nets are schools. Schools are where kids can get meals. Schools are where they see a social worker. Schools are where they see nurses. Even though all of those have been cut, what Scott was talking about, when we were younger, there was more services. There are at least those services, and oftentimes some of the only meals they get are at school. And so with this crisis, it's been very challenging. I had a town hall with 2 school board members and a teacher who's a Lowell AP teacher. I think was one of your son's teacher, Michelle, right? And she talked about how you have AP students at Lowell, and there were, I think it was 20 students she hasn't heard from. And again, it's not because they're not motivated, because they're clearly AP students at Lowell who were really good students, but probably busy with their family, busy with life. Something is happening in their life that they have unplugged, and they haven't got the normal social safety net that they would get in our schools. And so this is really concerning, because normally when you have that face-to-face contact, you can kind of check in. When you see somebody in the hallway, you can kind of talk to them. But when you don't, and then not only that, but they're not Zooming into class or not dialing into class or not checking in, it's really problematic. And I think we've done an amazing job in San Francisco of making sure that safety net is as strong as possible by really making sure it's, families were taken care of first. But I don't think that other districts have been able to do the same across the state. And it's very problematic for so many kids.
Yeah, I have some opinions on this, not just about schools, but workplaces, etc. And I also, just full disclosure, I don't have kids, so I don't pretend to be an expert in raising children or educating children. But I have just been observing, and I think that there is a narrative out there, and people are way jumping the gun onto what are the permanent changes that COVID-19 is going to place on our society. Everything's going to be different. It's going to be all remote learning. It's going to be all remote workplace. Twitter is saying we might never bring our workers back. I don't know how on earth Jack Dorsey can say that. You don't know. It's just been going on for a couple of months now. We don't know what it's going to look like when enormous numbers of people are working. If they're working from home for 6 or 9 months or a year, what that means for society, for employers. And we don't know, like the people who are saying, well, we can just do a lot more remote learning. We don't have to do as much of the in-person learning anymore. And I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I'm not saying that remote learning doesn't have a place, but there is so much that you get for children being around other children every day, for children having that outlet to not be with their families all the time and have teachers and other people that they can also rely on. And I get very worried that we have these narratives about, oh, everything's going to be permanently the way it is now, which I think is, there's no way we can say that. We are going to get past this pandemic, whether it's a vaccine or an effective treatment or whatever it is, just like we got past the 1918 flu pandemic. And I have a lot of concerns about, there are kids who are certainly probably having terrific experiences at home because of resources and space and having all the right hardware, and parents who are able to really stay on the kids and work with them and help educate them. But we know that there are so many kids who are struggling right now, that they're not getting the same, anything near the same level of educational enrichment. Kids who may have problems at home, whether it's lack of food, or whether it is an abusive situation, or whether it's LGBT kids who don't have supportive families and no longer have that outlet at school, or people who are just not able to interact with their friends and all of the benefit that brings. So I have concerns about far too many kids who are, I'm sure, are struggling at home. And I have concerns when we hear these broad narratives that this is going to be the permanent new normal, which I don't think is true.
And I'll just say, this better not be the permanent new normal, because remote learning certainly ain't working that well for my 4-year-old son. And I'm sure what I'm saying is probably true for so many of us who are trying to sort of figure this out. And the thing that's sort of amazing about this time period is, we're all on Zoom right now. So all of us have access to the technologies to get on. The estimates are 25-35% of African-American families, Latinx families, low-income families, rural families don't have access to the internet, don't have hardware, don't have a safe or accessible place in their home to study. I saw the statistic that they're estimating about 1 million students of the 6 million students we have are in this place. And as we are often discussing with our colleagues, the cliche, the digital divide, the incredible gap that exists is only exacerbating. And so while everyone is experiencing learning loss, there are huge swaths of students who are experiencing it 10 times worse. And so, coronavirus has really shown a very bright light on what is not working and what wasn't working before the pandemic. And it will take us a lot of time to bring it back. And it showcases the fact that we do have tremendous inequality in our society. And we're going to have to figure out all sorts of innovative ways to close that gap. And unfortunately, education has been or was supposed to be that great equalizer, and that's what we're all challenged in talking about today. But all that being said, certainly a topic of huge focus and a real concern for many of us in the legislature.
Thank you. Yes, just to kind of a couple of final notes, because I know we're getting to the end of our time together here. Yeah, I think probably a lot of us have seen the articles and projections about the learning loss, certainly the digital divide and the digital use divide, that even some families, once they are able to have the technology, they may not know how to use it and access it in a way that provides them, equitable opportunities. So that's another issue, and we're not able to be in person with people to show them how to do that in this moment. And we also, there's this great quote that sort of goes along the lines of, don't let a good crisis go to waste. It's taking advantage of opportunity where it exists. And so we do have some of that opportunity here, both to look at how we're funding, to look at how we're addressing the inequities in our systems. I'll ask this sort of question. I see there's a couple things over here that I might try to pull in these last few minutes in the comments in the chat box, but knowing that there's a lot that will continue happening, that has been happening over these couple of months and into the summer, how can we build in the time and the resources to assess before school starts next year what needs exist, so that build in the flexibility into our budgets, into our priorities to address those needs as we learn about them. We can predict what some of them will be, but some of them we're not going to know fully because this is new. We're not going to fully know what some of those needs are for another 2 or 3 months before we're getting into the fall. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's so hard, Michelle, because I'm a PTA parent, so I know that you all normally are doing your budgets right about now, talking about next year and what you put money towards, and it's so different. All the things we're discussing in the budget right now weren't things that we were discussing 4 months ago. So it is an environment where it's constantly changing every day. It seems like it's different. What we were talking about even 4 weeks ago is different than what we're talking about today. And I think as PTAs and schools, and I feel for all the principals that this is going to be just a very challenging time. I think we as parents are just going to have to roll with it. I know we already have. And the one, I think if I took one silver lining out of this is, I know that all of us on this call had so much respect for teachers. And I think that with everyone's kids at home, I bet, boy, every parent has so much more respect for teachers and the job they do, the incredible job they do, and how hard it is. And so that was my one silver lining that we should frankly take advantage of, because you always hear about, what the teachers union this, or those lazy teachers this or that. And obviously there's always, one or two, or there's always a few here and there. But overall, it's amazing the incredible job that teachers do. And it's an opportunity to just, I think as parents and as voters, talk about what we need to do to support them, what kind of resources, like you said, and do that discussion. So I think part of it is really for all of us in the PTAs, talking to our principals, talking to our teachers about what they need. Because I know we normally get that Amazon wish list in the beginning of the year, and I bet it's going to be different than normal.
Yeah, and to build on that, actually, is there anything in this, if David or Scott wanted to add on to this, is there anything that you think is now politically more accomplishable because of the coronavirus, and because of the coronavirus and what the place we find ourselves in, that maybe wasn't possible, taking advantage of this opportunity in this moment? Anything a little bit more politically viable?
I think a lot of things are more politically viable. I mean, there's some things that are harder, anything that's going to cost money, for example, or significant money. But I think that, so for example, the mental health and addiction bill that we talked about at the beginning to mandate insurance coverage, that's a bill that, it's a sympathetic bill, but that's always a huge fight with the insurance companies and others. That bill was heard in health committee this morning, and it just flew through. And I didn't even have to prompt people, other senators, to say, okay, COVID is really, really making this worse. We really need this. And so that kind of bill that might have been a bigger fight, I'm not saying it won't be a fight. It's certainly not guaranteed to pass. Nothing is. But I think it creates more political space for it. Also on housing, and Phil and David and I have all been in various ways very active on housing, and I've been very active in particular on trying to make it easier to build a lot more housing of every kind. I had a huge fight earlier this year, as you may recall. And I think that Nimbyism is not going to do well with COVID-19, because Nimbyism in many ways is sort of the selfish side of humanity coming out. We all have it in us. We all have the selfless communal side and the selfish side of playing the tug of war with each other as human beings. And Nimbyism is the more selfish side. Instead of saying, hey, I want other people to have housing, even if it means more people in my neighborhood. And people, when we have a pandemic, we're coming together, and people look at the bigger picture. We have a huge threat to our entire community. And so I think it's harder for people to make those kinds of arguments about, I know there are a lot of people who need housing. I know young people can't afford it. I know people are getting evicted. I know people are living in cars, but I don't want my neighborhood to change at all. It's harder to make that argument during a pandemic. Streamlining the CalFresh application process, which we're trying to do. That bill I've been doing for a few years, and we keep failing. I think we can get it done this year because people are seeing, oh my God, look what's happening at the food banks. And so I think there are a lot of political openings.
Thank you. I know that we are hitting at least Lucas's bedtime, and so Assemblymember Chiu's son is getting ready to say goodnight, and I think we want to wind this up. I just wanted to make sure, I just heard we get often wrapped up in acronyms, and so I wanted, Scott just mentioned Nimbyism, and so I just wanted to, if people aren't familiar with what that is, it's not in my backyard, it's folks that, anyway, that's what it stands for. And there are a few chats that are great happening over here, and there are some resources that I will share in a follow-up email tomorrow. Before I let these three folks, our representatives, give a few final thoughts, I wanted to, I just forgot what I was going to do. I totally forgot. I'm going to just let you give your final thoughts, and I'm sure I'll think of it while you're talking. But we're gonna close up the evening. If you have anything else you'd like to share before we end. Oh, I know what I was going to say is I will share all of your office's contact information. So if any of you didn't have a chance to ask a question, or there were a couple of questions that were in the chat box we didn't get to, you can send them to me. But I'll also forward all of their office's contact information to you by Friday, so that you can contact them and their staff directly. So, final words from all three of you. We could start with Senator Wiener and then move to David Chiu and then Phil Ting last.
Great. Again, thank you for tonight, and thank you for the honor of allowing me to represent you. As Michelle said, we're at your disposal. This has been a very hard time, and I want to really thank my district staff in particular, who have been working very, very hard from home, but working with constituents who are people who are really suffering in a lot of ways, in many, many ways. One of them that I just want to mention for anyone who's experiencing this or knows people experiencing it, our unemployment process is just a mess right now. And we are, we're trying to help people access unemployment, and I know David and Phil's offices are as well. The Employment Development Department has been just completely overwhelmed, and in fairness, they got more applications in 2 weeks than they did in an entire year. And even in the Great Depression, it took a few years for the unemployment to tick up to 20–25%. we're seeing that, in a couple months. And so they're being overwhelmed. Their IT is outdated. It's not an excuse, just an explanation. We are really working, and I know both the Assembly and the Senate, to get them to be faster and more responsive and make it more user-friendly for people. Because there are a lot of people right now who've been out of work for a couple months. They are, and they're delayed getting their unemployment. So I just want to put that out there because it's an issue that matters to a lot of people, and we're trying to work to make it better. But thank you for having us tonight, and please don't hesitate to contact my district office, 415-557-1300, or senator.weiner@senate.ca.gov if you need anything. Thank you.
And I'll also just echo the thanks as well. And sorry for the ear-piercing call for my son to go to bed at 8:30, which is what we try to do. I was thinking about the question before of what can we do to help our schools. And I think the name of PTAs, we always sort of take for granted the parent-teacher part. But that is really where, where I think the power comes in our community pulling together. I know that's something but whatever we can do to support that, we're happy to. I also want to encourage you not just to reach out to us if you need help, but reach out to us with ideas. Because as they say about politicians, we are, we're a jack of all trades, a master of none. We have to know, a couple inches about everything. But many of you are real subject matter experts on many things. And I want to in particular thank Michelle, who I think probably advises all three of us on a variety of things. But there are many of you on this call who I've had the chance to work with over the years. If you have ideas and thoughts on what we do, please let us know. I think the last thing I'm going to say is my wife runs a foster care refugee program in the Bay Area. And so she has kids who literally are mostly orphaned from wars around the world. And her staff picks them up from the airports and puts them into foster care families. And it's among the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And it's remarkable to me how during this time period, speaking about the crisis and the opportunity, the compassion that I am seeing of people who are saying, as tough as it is for me, we want to be there for everyone else. That's how we're going to get through this. And I know that's what this PTA is invested in. So look forward to working with all of you. And we are going to get through this. It's going to be painful. Our kids are going to scream at us a lot, but at some point down the line, we will have that conversation 20 years from now when we're all a lot older and a lot grizzled with our kid, and we'll say, "Do you remember what I did for you during the pandemic?" And we're going to get through this. So thank you.
Thank you.
And like Scott and David, I also wanted to thank my staff. They've been working nonstop. We've seen a huge uptick in people just needing help with EDD, and before that with DMV. So again, I know that Mark Checkelbane put in the chat box our contact information if anybody needs any assistance. Also, just thanks to you, Michelle, and to the 2nd District PTA for all the support you have of all the parents, but all the schools. I mean, parents are such core constituents and stakeholders for every single school. We are the ones that come together, and that's what's been, I think, so hard is we get a sense of community from other parents. Our kids get a sense of community from their friends in schools, and not really being able to have that connection has been very challenging. And the hardest part is not even being able to tell them and tell any of us how long this is going to be going for, whether it's going to go in the fall, whether it's going to go in the spring, when this might actually end. And so I just wanted to say thank you to all the folks who have been part of this call for everything you do for every single one of your schools. It's your support, it's your fundraising, it's you working with all your teachers that really make those schools go around, and that is so, so important. So again, just a thank you for everybody as San Franciscans. It's been a pleasure just watching everybody come together to first staying at home, but also just supporting each other, whether it's virtually, whether it's at the food bank, whether it is at a variety of different community services. We've really, as a city, shown our best, have put our best foot forward. And so really appreciate everybody who's a key part of that. And again, thanks for your patience going into this school year. We're going into the great unknown. We don't know quite how it's going to work, but we'll get through it. We will definitely get through it. And we're going to make sure that our kids continue to learn and that our schools continue to be supported. And as a community, we're going to make sure that we're going to get through this next few months. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all three of you for your leadership and for taking the time to be here with us for this whole hour. We really appreciate it. I just remember when I was the legislation chair last time, about 10 years ago for the district PTA, we had a bunch of parents go to meet with Assemblymember Tain, who is the person who held the seat before David did. And the thing that he said to us that really stuck out to me was, I don't know unless you tell me. You have to tell me what's important. You have to tell me what is important to the community and educate me on issues that matter to you, because I can't read your mind and I don't know everything. And so it's really up to us as parents and as just San Franciscans to let our representatives know what's important to us and what we want to see happening in the laws that are made that impact our own communities. So thank you all for being available to us. To everybody else, all the participants, those who are still around, thanks again. I'm going to send you by Friday. I'll send you again contact information for all the district offices. I will send you a link to the recording of this meeting. And then just one final reminder, you will, our next week, next Wednesday, we'll be having the superintendent, Dr. Matthews, on our 411 meeting, and I will send you a link to register for that by Friday. So thank you all and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yes.
Thanks to all of you.
I don't need both. So like,
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh my, I want the ice cream sandwich, please.
Okay.
You.
It's in there.
It's in my mom's.
It's in the freezer.